Good morning everyone, selamat pagi semua. Welcome to the Matheson Library. This is our last session for Monash Indonesian Discussion Series this year. Can't believe we actually finally have the last session, Pak Ariel. I think it has been a great year for Matheson Library and also for the ongoing collaboration between the library and Hafid Indonesian Center. This event, which was used to be called Bukan Rumpi Tapi Diskusi, is still a great place to share research, interest on Indonesia, and more importantly, to gather as a community. So thank you for everyone who has been attending and coming to this event and have been such great supporters and friends of the library. It also has been a great year for the center, I think, with running a number of major events, such as the Hafid Dialogue and the Chinese-Indonesian Identities and Histories Conference, October this year, which has received a very, very positive feedback from the participants and also from a wider audience. Now, the last session for today, we have Dr. Susi Brodsky, who is a senior lecturer in modern history at Monash University. I will be handing it over to Pak Ariel to introduce our speaker today. But before we hear her presentation, I would like to mention a couple of things. So the first one is take a look at the library collection that I have prepared to be in line with the topic area for today. I look for your books, Susie. 3 of them at least are out on loan. So, I was asking women to help me out. I said, am I going blind? I can't find any books. So obviously, people are using the books. So secondly, I would like to draw your attention to the recent digitization project completed by Monash University Library. Some of you might remember that we have digitized SINPO, and we recently completed Star Weekly. So Star Weekly was a weekly magazine published in Jakarta in Indonesia by Kengpo, the second most popular daily newspaper among Peranakan Chinese. It offered news, opinions, features to Peranakan Chinese as well as to the wider public. PK Oyong was the chief editor of Star Weekly, who later co-founded Kompas, the largest and most popular newspaper in Indonesia. It covered a vast range of topics, including political analysis, world news, social issues, sport, cooking, and entertainment. Now, Star Weekly was particularly important for Chinese Indonesian history because it was the place where the assimilationist movement published their ideas. The group urged Chinese Indonesians to participate actively in ethnically inclusive organization and must dissociate socially and culturally from the Chinese tradition. Star Weekly was closed due to the oppressive political atmospheres in 1961. Now we have Irena here from the Digitization and Research Repositories team, who will explain to you about how to access Star Weekly from Monash Collection online website.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me? Okay, so I just want to show you just briefly our recent digitization project. As Reni mentioned, we digitized the Star Weekly collection, and if you want to have a look at the collection, you may find our repository from the Monash University Library website, or in Google type Monash Collections Online, or you can retrieve it from the URL repository.monash.edu. So this is, you can see the homepage of our Monash Collection online, and if you want to retrieve Star Weekly, you can, from this tab at the top, browse the collections. Star Weekly was recently added, and it will show up at the top. And if you click on the link, you will see a brief description of the collection with the URL, the identifier that you can use to share the collection if you like, if you want to promote it, if you are citing in any publication or in your research. And then at the bottom, you will see the Star Weekly and Star Magazine divided by year. We decided to divide the collection by year to help researchers in retrieving what they need. But if you want to search and browse the full collection, you can search from here. You can click this link. And so you will get all these 669 items digitized. And you can scroll and you will see a brief description, and then you can look into each of them. So just briefly, this is how each item is displayed. You will see the PDF appearing. Now the connection is a bit slow, but it will appear the PDF straight away. And you can browse and scroll the PDF from this screen that is not appearing. I'm sorry about that. Or downloading the PDF straight away. Let's try another record. Yeah. Yeah, because this morning our technicians were doing some work on the repository, so maybe that's why. But below you will find some brief descriptive metadata, and again the link to share a specific item. So you can share the collection and cite each item as well. If, as Reni mentioned, we digitized also Simpo in last year, and if you would like to promote the collection, use it in your post and research, our page will track how many times the collection handle is used. So, for example, for Simpo, again, in the main page of the collection, you see the description divided by year, and in this case, we have this nice blue donut that shows that this collection was cited 14 times in Twitter. So, if you have any question, if you want to retrieve some image in high resolution, please let me know. I will be happy to provide everything. And if you think the Monash collections have something that should be digitized, please let Reni and Anita know, and my team will be happy to put everything online. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Irina, and congratulations. I have spent maybe the past 10 years trying to scan Star Weekly in Leiden, spent thousands of dollars of the ERC grants. Now I don't have to leave my room to do this. I don't have to leave my chair, actually. Thank you so much. It's been great. My name is Ariel Herianto from the Hervey Center. I am director of the center, and I wish to welcome you all to final Melbourne Monash Indonesia Seminar Series. I'd like to acknowledge the people of the Kulin Nations on whose land we are gathered today, and pay my respect to their elders past and present. I also would like to extend my special welcome to the delegation from Universitas Negeri Malang, Bapak Rofiuddin, Director, and the group, Mbak Evi Liana and the group. Yeah. I also would like to welcome Pak Prima from the Consul General of Indonesia. Pak Prima always like to avoid giving speeches. He's a very shy diplomat. I'd like to remind you, in case you have not done so, to switch a mobile phone on a silent mode. So we are so lucky today to have Dr. Susi Brodsky to share with us her recent work on disaster work, histories of Indonesian lives and livelihoods around volcanoes. As Reni said, Susi has published lots and lots of things, so I will not go through that. I just let you know that she is now a senior lecturer in modern history at Monash University. Her latest book is entitled Photographic Subjects by Manchester University Press this year. Congratulations, Susi. Now the time is yours.
Thank you. Okay, so thank you very much for having me in this seminar series, and Hello again to the distinguished visitors today, and thank you to colleagues for coming along. I will stand so that you can see me from behind poles and things. So, in the second half of last year, I was in the Netherlands looking at archives from the colonial period to work on this project. I was in the Tropen Museum, which of course was founded in the 19th century as a colonial institute, focusing especially on what were then Dutch colonies, Indonesia, and the 6 colonies in the Caribbean, as well as Suriname, all of which were in the tropics, which is why it was called the Tropical Institute. So I was there looking for photographs of natural disasters in Indonesia, going through many boxes of albums and loose photographs, when I came across what had once been a personal album that had belonged to Europeans who were living in Indonesia. And it contained this photograph of the eruption of Gunung Bromo on Java in 1954. So I think the composition of the photograph encourages us to adopt a certain perspective. The 3 Dutch figures have their backs to us, and because we can't see their faces, which is quite unusual for an amateur snapshot portrait, we want to know what they are looking at. We can see what they're looking at. There's the billowing cloud of volcanic ash and smoke. We can also see what the photographer standing behind them saw. So the whites of all of their clothes and shoes mirror and lead the viewer's eye to that bright plume in the centre. Blending into the dark contrast in the foreground stand 2 Indonesian porters and a pony. They occupy the same foreground as the Dutch spectators, and they're at the same resolution as the other elements of the photograph, but they remain somehow less visible, cast into shadow, not looking up at us and not looking at the volcano. And yet the porters are there. So maybe the problem around seeing them sits with me and my expectations of what I hope to find in a colonial archive. This dilemma might be viewed as a metaphor for histories of Indonesia in the 19th and early 20th century for historians of this period who have to think about colonialism and its legacies as I do. This is the period that I specialise in. So since the photograph was taken by a Dutch person in Indonesia and is in a colonial archive, although it was taken 4 years after Indonesia won its independence, we want to focus on how the image reproduces colonial perspectives which are inherently based in the unequal imperial exercise of rights to power. And when I was at the Tropen Museum last year, a very famous scholar of photography and colonialism called Ariela Azule gave a public talk basically making this argument. So such a dynamic certainly inflects this album and this specific archive that holds it, but it's by no means the only interpretation available. Historians of colonialism and post-colonial theorists of photography such as Christopher Pinney, Elizabeth Edwards and the Australian Jane Lydon, to name just a few, have long argued that it can paradoxically revive and enhance neo-colonial power to interpret sources and photographs in particular in only this way, without regard for how they may sit within present and historic communities of subjects and spectators. It takes the framing of new questions drawn from historical case studies, from Indigenous activism, and from a range of theoretical and methodological approaches to colonial sources to see empirical evidence for alternative stories and perspectives in these photos. So I was at the Tropen Museum to do precisely that, to work on a current ARC discovery project called Human Suffering and Colonial Photography. My project seeks to understand Indonesian experiences of disaster as represented in photography over the first century of its existence. So from roughly 1840 to 1950, when Indonesia has its sovereignty recognised. A period, or 1949, a period that coincides also with the last century of Dutch rule in Indonesia. So as is so often the case when you get away from planning at your computer screen and you actually go to the archives or you go into the field if you're an anthropologist or whatever it is that your discipline demands that you do, my research focus shifted when I began working with the sources themselves. I started out thinking I was going to be concentrating on the acute phase of disasters, where all the suffering is, like my project title says. But then I discovered what was far more interesting and maybe more important, which is the question of how photography and the sources around it, because I don't just use photographs, they're fairly limited if you use them on your own, how photography helps us understand how Indonesians have lived with disaster over a longer term. So I should have thought of this sooner, because for years I have been reading and teaching an interdisciplinary scholarship that discusses both environmental catastrophe and war and conflict as processes where the acute phase is preceded by social factors that condition vulnerabilities to disaster. These are concepts familiar to historians, human geographers, anthropologists, even scientists. These same factors in my discipline, you would call them historical and cultural context, also shape individual and community resilience, recovery, reconstruction for conflict, peace, justice and reconciliation. Things like who gets to claim victim status, who is a hero in a disaster, whose experiences form the master narrative of how particular disasters are remembered or forgotten. So I'm not going to talk about war and conflict, which is the other area that I have been working on today. I'm going to separate that out and focus on environmental disasters. Oh, I've done it again. Not listening. For Indonesia, this framework of understanding disasters as processes and thinking about the historical contexts that shape vulnerability and resilience to disaster is really relevant because, of course, it is an archipelago on the Pacific Ring of Fire, which is all this section in pink, and all of Indonesia is inside it or along it. Volcanoes, earthquakes, and floods have shaped its human and ecological history. Volcanoes, or volcanic mountains, feature prominently in Indonesian histories as sites of civilization and cosmological significance. Volatile places of making and unmaking, volcanoes figure profoundly in Indonesian art, performance, religion and mythology for their capacity to wreak disaster, while also forming the cradles of prosperous kingdoms and sacred spaces. So I've got there Gunungan from Wayan. Of course, Borobudur is situated in a valley surrounded by volcanoes and mountains. And this last picture of Gunung Gede is by Basuki Abdullah, who was Sukarno's one of his favourite painters. So volcanoes have long captured the imagination of artists in Indonesia, including the 19th century painter Raden Saleh, whose paintings of Gunung Merapi, erupting by day and by night, in 1865 now hang, unfortunately, in the National Gallery of Singapore. And it was Ariel who brought this to my attention. He found this beautiful chromolithograph after a drawing by J.C. Rappard, who was very typical for 19th century draftspeople, a member of the colonial army in the KNIL. And this shows Merapi in Sumatra, and I like this picture so much because it shows the fertility that volcanoes bring and Indonesians working in the shadow of the volcano. So the period that I'm looking at, sort of 1840s to 1950-ish, we can look at that for now. Indonesia's frequent natural disasters were captured through the new medium of photography, which quickly proliferated across the archipelago, not just at the sites where it was practiced, but also in the different functions and audiences it grew to serve. So in the beginning, say from the 1840s to 70s, photography was used in Indonesia for archaeological research, scientific and ethnographic expeditions, and military purposes. But these functions expanded and overlapped with consumer uses like commercial and studio photography, postcards, and commissioned albums. So that's happening from the 1860s to the 1910s. Amateur photography, so ordinary people with handheld cameras, that really takes off in the 1920s, as does the use of photographs and photographic techniques to illustrate newspapers like Sinpo and printed books and journals. So the earliest disaster photographers really in Indonesia were arguably commercial operators and I guess military staff, like this guy, C.B. Nieuwenhuis, who takes this very famous picture of the effect of a banjir at the Anai Cleft on Sumatra's west coast, and it's reproduced very often after the 1890s. Then there is Onis Kurcian, who was an Armenian photographer who set up a studio that exists long after the 1890s. He takes these photos of Bromo in the 1890s, and they circulate long after. And Tilly Weissenborn, who's very famous for her Bali pictures and her pictures also of Garut. She's associated with Photolux, the studio, from the 20s to the 40s. So they're the first people, commercial photographers largely, who are taking photographs of volcanoes and sometimes also of disasters, if you like, in Indonesia. So from the late 19th century onwards, I should say that these kinds of photos, of course, emphasise the spectacularity of volcanic landscapes and natural disasters. They're sort of more placidly active volcanoes, if you like. They show the picturesque smoking crater, and they emphasise colonial notions of tropicality, which of course for the Dutch particularly, who come from flat landscapes with no mountains, all of this is terribly different and exciting and curious for them from their perspective. But from the late 19th century onwards, we have a grislier genre of photography emerge, documenting the human toll of disasters, including razed villages, the dead and wounded, and refugees. So these were the kinds of photographs that I had in mind for examining when I began my project, and indeed they will have an important place in my research. So this one are photographs of an earthquake at Wonosobo in 1924. You can see the houses in a village that have been destroyed, people who have been wounded and are being treated by the CNIL, this is the colonial army, and then an eruption of Merapi in 1930, which is particularly bad. You can see the destruction of crops and villages, livestock who have been killed, and refugees who are going to a camp that's been set up again by the colonial army. As I work through the archives, though, I've had to acknowledge how frequently photographers were drawn. So this exists, images of the acute phase of disaster, but photographers are drawn to volatile tropical landscapes, which only sometimes turn disastrous. And it made me think about how 19th and early 20th century Indonesians were living with disaster as a constant possibility and in ways that are integrated into everyday life. And I think that warrants closer inspection. So commercial photographers, like the ones that I showed you before, stimulated European tourism to volcano sites in colonial Indonesia. So I've discovered just how important photography was for volcano enthusiasts, who often combined a hobby interest in the emerging science of geology and volcanology, which really takes off in the 19th century, with motor tours of Java to the hill stations in volcanic mountain ranges. So such tours typically involve a visit to a nice hotel, guided tours, and hiking parties. Indeed, the most popular and frequently photographed destinations were on Java and were places like Gunung Papandayan, which is accessible from the resort town of Garut, and Bromo, Semeru, and Batok, in the Tengger Ranges. So commercial photographs from the 1890s and 1900s had an important afterlife for decades after their making, well into the era of amateur photography, which seriously took off in the 1920s. In many of the albums that I've looked at, volcano enthusiasts collected old commercial photographs and mingled them together with their own self-made snapshots of the same locations. Sometimes the two kinds of photos were laid side by side as though the album maker was recording a goal achieved. So with the commercial photograph that inspired them to seek out the volcano in the first place, next to the snapshot taken by their own hand beside it. These practices show that commercial photos made in the age of tripods and brittle glass plates were placed in interaction with those of amateurs using handheld cameras and roll films 30, 40 years later. So changes in technology didn't displace the circulation of older images, and on the contrary, earlier commercial photos became iconic as references for amateur photographers and tourists. The social function of volcano photographs, old and new, was to inspire but also document journeys that travellers were making through Indonesia's picturesque, spectacular and volatile landscapes. The modes in which Europeans interacted with Indonesia's environment as tourists and adventurers were shaped by photography. What such photographs do is, I think, signal the intrepid achievements of the photographer, willing to brave the volatile tropics in pursuit of an impressive view and a rare experience. But as histories, critical histories of European science and archaeology have repeatedly shown, colonial records often encourage us to focus on the exploits of the person who does the recording. What's dawned on me as I've been looking more carefully at photos in the archives was the presence of Indonesians as porters and guides to European volcano enthusiasts. So for many years I looked at that Krugjian photo and I thought, oh, that man with the pony, that must be Krugjian, right? That's him putting himself in the photo. When you blow it up and you look at it in real life, you can see it's a porter. It's an Indonesian porter with a pony. And as you go through, all through the 1910s, and into the 50s, lots of the people who are serving as guides, taking European scientists and amateur hikers up into these volcanic landscapes, carrying their gear, carrying food, and often carrying the cameras, are Indonesians who are working as guides, which is a no-brainer because if you have ever done a tour in Indonesia, the same thing happens today. So it was Indonesian expertise and hard graft that enabled the exploring of European scientists, adventurers and amateur climbers. Indonesians were there right from the beginning in the work of commercial photographers, and their presence only became stronger as amateur photographers took their cameras with them. Intrepid European photographer adventurers were reliant on the Indonesians who worked among the volcanoes, guiding unfamiliar visitors through the terrain and carrying their luggage often on the backs of ponies. So the photographs lead us to the question, who is really the intrepid explorer in colonial era photographs of volcano tourism? Significantly, the consumers of volcano tourism frequently included evidence of Indonesian porters and guides in their photos in ways that other sources don't. So the first thing that I did after finding a lot of these images was to go to the printed material that was produced by hotels and tourist agencies at the same time in many languages, as it turns out. So there was a handbook that was printed in Dutch in 1922 in Garut, which was a resort town with a number of hotels, and it's that town that's made famous by Tilly Weissenborn in the Photolux studio. So you could take tours and see a number of volcanoes from there. The guidebook included prices for hiring a car and driving around Java to see volcanoes. It turns out that you could hire what they called a coolie to carry a breakfast picnic or camera equipment, which is explicitly mentioned, the camera, for half a guilder. To go to Kawa Kamojang, it cost 7 guilders to hire a horse with guides, to hire a litter, which is a chair that's carried by coolies. If you want 4 coolies, it costs 8 guilders. If you need 6, because it's a bit heavy, it costs 10 guilders. It's not clear, I should say, what the guidebook means by coolies. Do they really mean an indentured labourer? Which is it becomes illegal in the 1930s. So that will be an interesting trail to follow Or do they mean a manual labourer, somebody who does heavy lifting and heavy work? Guides were paid at half a guilder per person. So if there's a group of 6 of you going on the tour, you each put in 50 guilder cents, whatever that is. To give you a sense of relative value, it cost 3.5 guilders per person to have lunch at the Hotel Sanatorium in Ghana. So a guide is much cheaper than lunch, and a coolie is about twice 2 lunches to take you all the way up there. So that's the picture, labour and its value that you get from other sources at the back of the guidebook. So without the knowledge, experience and labour of Indonesians and their pack animals, few of the photographs that now exist in colonial archives would have been made. Another form of working and living on volcanoes that I first got a sense of from looking at photographs is in the images of sulphur mines that we see when Europeans tour volcanoes. These photographs have led me to start researching the mining of sulphur in Indonesia. Sulphur was used most heavily in the sugar industry, which of course is one of the biggest and most industrialised industries in Indonesia in the 19th century. And the most industrialised version of sugar happens in Indonesia. It has the most industrialised sugar industry in the 19th century. So it's used to refine sugar to get it fine and white. It's also used at rubber plantations, which is of course a huge booming industry in Indonesia by the 1920s. So it's basically used as a pesticide to prevent mildew. And it's also used as an incendiary in petroleum refining. And so places like Balikpapan, which are very important for the colonial economy in the early 20th century. Sulphur was exported in fairly small quantities to the Netherlands, but also to British India and to South Africa from Indonesia. The biggest producers in the world were actually Japan and Italy, both places with volcanoes. The sulphur mines in the Dutch Empire were in Indonesia and the East Indies, but also in the West Indies at 2 places, at Aruba and Sabah. So colonial photos link Indonesian sulphur miners to the industries that use sulphur all over the archipelago in other parts of the Dutch Empire and around the world in the 19th and 20th centuries. The Ministry for Colonies began collecting data and research on mining and extraction industries in Indonesia in the 1870s, and we have records up to 1938, and then they stop again, basically, until after independence. The major industries with the largest volume of exports, products and workers were tin, petroleum, coal, precious metals like gold and silver, and then some other minerals like bauxite. The colonial government held concessions in these big industries. Keep in mind that the Netherlands has got very few natural energy sources. Now they have natural gas, but in the 19th century and the 20th century, not much. So these were important components of a colonial economy, along with the plantation goods. There were also big colonial companies involved in production, one called the General Industrial Mining and Exploitation Company. And then there were smaller concessions for I guess, all of these extraction industries that were given to Indonesian producers. Sulphur production is recorded from the 1910s in small quantities to begin with. It was initially regarded as a small-scale industry, and the way that the colonial ministry recorded it is under the section native industry, which means Indonesian. Economic historians often refer to the dual economy of the Netherlands Indies, the big government concessions and trading companies that were capital intensive and that ran the export sector, and then the smallholders who were mostly Indonesian and Chinese Indonesian, who were producers who sold goods on the local market. Now, and I think this holds true very much for what we're kind of about to see here. So the Dutch were only really beginning to explore an interest in making refined sulphur at competitive cost in the 1930s. There were a growing number of government leases issued to this industry in that decade. So at Kawaputi near Bandung, the General Industrial Mining and Exploitation Company, in the mid-1930s, there were 650 Indonesians working at this plant, and they were producing around 11 tonnes of refined sulphur. And that fluctuates somewhat in the mid-1930s. By 1938, this factory has 18 Europeans working, 5 Chinese, it's very colonial to put everyone into different ethnic categories, and 863 Indonesians. So it's a big employer. Meanwhile, at Welirang in East Java in 1938, 239 tonnes of sulphur were being collected by Indonesians and sold on the local market. The ministry is making distinctions between these two different kinds of mining. The big concessions, the big companies, and then the one that's done by Indonesians for the local market. But that's 239 tonnes by Indonesians as opposed to 11 tonnes at places like this. In 1934, the ministry recorded 97 tonnes. In 1935, it was 171 tonnes, so it fluctuates wildly. But it's much, much bigger in volume than the ones that are being managed by the colonial government and big business. Now, the records don't say, and this is something that I want to pursue, what the local uses for sulphur were as opposed to the ones from government concessions. But it goes to the question of whether it's useful to make this dual economy distinction. If the unrefined sulphur from both kinds of places ends up in the same sort of in the same industries, then is it really useful to make this distinction? I would say not, except for one thing. One thing. For the large government concessions, the ministry kept records of the number of deaths and injuries, recorded by name and profession every year. So if you're an Indonesian working in tin mining or in petroleum and you had an injury or you died on the job, your name and your profession was recorded and it was counted by the ministry. This is not the case for sulphur mining, which is significant because we know that it was an expanding industry. It was largely unregulated. It's outside of the concessions and it's mostly employing Indonesians and it's highly toxic. So there's a prominent sulphur mine at Kawah Ijen, which is the volcano complex in East Java, of which the highest point is Gunung Merapi. So they're obviously far apart, but they're part of the same complex. And this is a menu by the shipping company, the Royal Dutch Packet Company. They would write out the menu and then they had a photo of the crater lake at Kawah Ijen. And this is the guy who took over from Krugjian in the studio, GP Lewis, who's also now making commercial studio photographs for sale of places like the crater lake at Kawah Ijen. So there's a prominent sulphur mine there. In 1910, the resident of Besuki, so the resident is the highest Dutch official in the region, gave a concession for a man recorded as Pak Suripa to mine sulphur in the native way. I have my theory about what that would mean at Ijen. I think it means basically using a pickaxe and baskets, and I'll show you a picture in a minute. I don't know what is happening at the sulphur plants that the Dutch are running. I'm going to look into it. So he's given a concession in 1910 to mine at Kawah Ijen. In 1916, he's no longer recorded as using that concession, but the statistic in between suggests a lot of production. In 1913, 1,326 tonnes of sulphur mined from Kawah Ijen. This is the smallholder production. Well, I mean, there's a concession, but then it falls into disuse. So again, this dual economy distinction is really not useful if you want to see the ways that Indonesians are actually working in this period. Now, Ijen has drawn the attention of photographers for more than a century It has a spectacular crater lake which is coloured an acidic turquoise, the largest of its kind in the world. It's featured in a number of film documentaries in the last decade or two. Mining is still done there using the same methods that have been in place for 100 years or more. By hand, using baskets and broken up with pickaxes. Workers are paid around $13 a day. The fumes are noxious. People take tours to see the blue flames, which I'll show you in a minute, that come out of the Ijen crater at night. It's these fumes that make the site toxic. Miners often take time out from their work to work as tour operators. So tourism and toxic mining occur side by side, and they have done for a long time. So this miner was interviewed for a story in the South China Morning Post in 2018. His name is Ahmed Aricin, and he's carrying 80 kilograms of sulfur on his shoulders. He was 47 at the time this photo was taken, according to the story, and he'd been doing the job for 28 years. He said he'd had his picture taken at this spot many times by tourists. There were dozens of men working with him. They mainly work at night because it's too hot to do the carrying in the day. And he often sold a few pieces of sulfur that he broke off from his load as before he knocked off from his shift to tourists on the way back. His load was used to refine sugar. So I've just gone off my white sugar. And isn't it interesting how sugar, after centuries, continues to be linked to shocking labour conditions for its production? The tourists that increasingly crowd the paths to the crater lake make Aricin's work more dangerous. Tourism here has been strongly promoted by the local government. From 2010 to 2018, the numbers of tourists increased fivefold. There are now about 4.8 million visitors to this crater lake a year. On weekends, up to 3,000 people trek up to the crater, a 2-hour walk to take pictures at night and take selfies, like this one, with the miners. So now, is it okay if we click on, or you might have to copy and paste the link?
Yeah.
I forgot to embed it. A National Geographic photographer has been credited with the tourist boom to Ijen. Olivier Grunewald, who claims to be the first person to have photographed the Blue Fire crater at night. I will check this. He also says that miners have been working on Ijen for over 40 years. I think we need to revise this upwards. Clearly there is a long history to this occupation that needs to be told, that people need to be more aware of. So they're spectacular pictures. Photographic records show, more strongly perhaps than oral history sources, which is what I think people who are working on this contemporary field are using, and more than written colonial sources, we have a jigsaw puzzle, if you like, that needs to be put together. But the photographic records show that Indonesians have done these jobs as miners, as guides, as porters, for at least a century, probably longer. Sulfur collection, tour guiding on volcanoes are linked to global histories of industry, labour, and of course to disaster. But what kind of disaster? Oh dear. The work of the environmental humanities scholar Rob Nixon, who's the author of Slow Violence and the Environmentalism of the Poor, I think is useful here. People living and working in environments that are toxic and ultimately deadly because they have few other options experience slow forms of violence because they have few other options. It's much more insidious than the acute phase of the disaster that captures international media attention and that prompts international aid. These slow forms of violence, which have, I think, as I said, at least 100-year history, are ultimately caused by structural inequalities in global economies that have colonial origins, that lead both to entrenched poverty but also often environmental degradation. Poor people's livelihoods depend on working in these environments, extracting what they can, often while tourists now look on. And again, this is something that has a history that precedes the age of the selfie and digital photography. You can see that people have been taking photos of the work that occurs on volcanoes for much, much longer. So disaster, I think, I also want to say disaster is something that people not only adapt to, but take advantage of and make opportunities from. Disaster is something that happens on the margins, but in plain sight. Photographs are important for helping to tell this story. They're important because they also provide a link to the present. They show, I think, also the way that we've often aestheticised disastrous livelihoods. They show that tourist guides and miners are professionals, workers, with long histories that continue today. They don't fit into the stories of guilds and masters and apprentices, or the kinds of crafts that Europeans were interested in when they were working as ethnographers and collectors in the 19th and 20th centuries. And they would work on things like wood carving and batik making and those kinds of industries. They didn't record in a sort of formal way these kinds of work that Indonesians were also doing. These are, I think, stories. There's a puzzle, as I said, that needs to be put together that will sort of illuminate histories of mining, exploration, industry, how it's related to tourism, but also pollution, poverty, and also survival and entrepreneurialism, which is part of the story of Indonesian histories of living and working as well as dying in disasters. Thank you.